Welcome to Connect to Develop, where we provide insight from healthcare leaders on the hottest topic and trends. Hello, listeners. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode where Marney and I will be talking about confidence versus competence. What really drives leadership? I'm your co-host, Erika DeLeon. Okay, we're going to dive right in. Marney, we've all seen it. Someone who walks in the room totally self-assured, even if they're not the most experienced person there. And also on the flip side of that, people who are incredibly capable, but hesitant to speak up. So that's really what we're going to be diving into today, is kind of the differences between confidence versus competence and the scenarios in which they come up. And we'll be talking through, how they're perceived and what it takes to actually move the needle in leadership. So with that background, let's talk about what's the difference. When you think of confidence versus competence, what is the true difference between the two? And do you find that one is more important than the other? Let's start there.
Ooh, spicy. I like it. I would say that for my summation, competence is having worked on a skill set or generated enough knowledge base or done something enough to where if you needed to successfully teach it to someone who knows nothing or very little about the subject, and for them to understand it, not necessarily do it, right? But to at least understand what you're doing or what they would need to do, then that's competence. Confidence is feeling like you either can do this, whether you can or not, or at least believing that you can get there in a quick enough pace to be able to pull through whatever it is that you've committed to, whether that's to actually do the job, teach the job, etc. Now, I don't think that any one is more important across the board. I think it depends. So, for instance, let's take an early career surgeon who maybe is just out of training. And for the first time in their life, they don't have their mentor or a very senior faculty member standing across from them or, in the room watching that they can immediately turn to if they're getting themselves into trouble, or if they have a question about the next step or, what they would do at that challenging part of the procedure. You have to have the confidence that you can get that patient through that procedure. And if you can't translate that confidence first to the patient and the patient's loved ones who are having you operate on them, but also to the people in the room who are looking to you to lead them, such as the circulator, the scrub tech, etc., then that's a problem. I think competence is what some people need to gain confidence to do what they need to be doing. And some people simply have the confidence that they know that they can get themselves to the point where they can successfully complete the job at hand. How about you? What are your thoughts?
I agree with you, Marney, in that the two are very important. I don't think one is more important than the other. I will say that I think some people lean on one more than the other, or at least that I've seen that in my experience, where one comes a little bit more naturally, or people lean into one area a little bit more than the other. And so that leaves maybe a 75%, 25%, ratio, let's say, of someone who might be leaning on competence versus confidence. But if they were able to lift that confidence side of the ratio, they could be more impactful. I have seen that. And frankly, I would say that I've experienced it myself. And so I think it just depends on the area, the subject matter area, and the specialty. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm trying to think through all the various different vocations that people could have. Competence, you can't get competent until you've been given the opportunity. So sometimes I almost wonder if the person that's going to be directly supervising you, so in the instance of, a new hire at a corporation, your hiring manager, your boss, leadership who brings you in, if they have the confidence that you have what it takes to become competent in the amount of time that they need you to, because at the end of the day, that's their political capital on the line. They're the ones that, brought you in, et cetera. Then I think their confidence in you can and maybe should translate over to you. There are some roles where you really need to be getting competent, like a pilot, right? You need to have X amount of hours of flying with major supervision before we want you flying people's lives around. So I don't think there's any one solution. I think you'd have to chunk this out not only into maybe industry, but even roles within those industries. They hire surgical device reps, put them, into a role where they're going to be proctoring surgeons. And these surgical device reps get anywhere from 1 week to 3 weeks in training, and then they're off and running. So, I think the biggest factor here that we haven't addressed yet is the self-awareness to know when you need help, and then the courage, bravery, willingness to admit you need help and go seek it before something bad happens. And I think that's where we get into trouble with people who are overconfident or undercompetent, is that lack of awareness and then the willingness to go out and ask for help.
It's a really good point. So how do you balance the two? Because you have to have that awareness. And so that means, okay, you have the awareness, and then because you have the awareness, you're going to respond to that. And so there's a balancing component to that. I just had this conversation. It's interesting that we're talking about this because over this past weekend, I was talking to someone, a friend of mine is a nurse practitioner. Her husband is an ICU doc. And one of the skill sets that he has is anesthesia. And we were talking about anesthesia and how, in order to keep up with those skill sets, he's always looking for the opportunity to be in the OR room as opposed to having a CRNA, for the purpose of making sure that the competence component, the skill set, is being met. And so he's really intentional about raising his hand. Look, I want to be in the OR, because he wants to make sure that he's maintaining that, as opposed to having a CRNA go in, or, if there's students involved or whatnot. But in order to do that, in order to build the confidence in that area, it's coupled with a balancing of, I have to make sure I'm continuing to massage that skill set.
That just sounds like a personality trait to me. You're always going to have people who, no matter how good they get, are going to constantly be humble enough to say, yeah, but I could get better, and constantly seek to hone that skill set. And then you're going to have people, and let's hope these people never are in charge of any lives in any way, shape, or form, that literally want to do the bare minimum, learn the bare minimum, and then skate by off of other people's work. So, I think we almost want to just tranche this down into a sector, right? So if we took healthcare, whether you're a clinician or you're a business person or an operator or administrator, I think what we really want to discuss is, how do you continue to maintain that desire and that need for the benefit of all, to continue building your competency level so that your confidence continues to stay at the top, to say, yes, I am the subject matter expert here. Yes, you should trust, your family member in my care, et cetera. So, I would love to actually hear how those people who are highly competent and yet don't have the confidence to maybe take on that next step or that next role, build that. What are the things that you did?
It's repetition, I guess, Marnie. It's the first thing that comes to mind is, the more that you do something, the more that you build the confidence to show up, because you've got a skill that you've just been continuing to develop. And so, yeah, repetition is the first thing that comes to mind. But the confidence piece, I would say, is not the thing that comes first for me, by all means. It's been the thing that I've had to probably work on and lean on the competence and repetition to then be able to show up confident. I guess, has there been a situation for you that you felt highly competent but not confident?
So once again, I think we get into personality here. I have never had that problem. I have always, if you ask my mom to explain, a 2-year-old child to you that she just couldn't, figure out, challenged her for the rest of her, life, and still going. I have never had the confidence problem. I've never thought that I was better per se than anyone. I just always felt like I cared enough and I was willing to work harder than anyone else around me to get there, to know that whatever I decided to take on. So classic example, for 6 years from my junior year of high school through the end of college, I had decided I was going to do this one industry. I was going to go into advertising. It was going to be great because I'd watched this, movie. What I didn't know at the time is that person worked at a large shop, and you would never do all the things that that person did in that movie at a large shop because you'd be siloed into one department. But that just seemed like the most glamorous, awesome, creative life. So I spent 6 years preparing for that. I literally sat down as soon as I got into college with that college program. I picked out every single course I was going to do in the course of it and graduate trilingual. And that didn't deviate even when I realized, halfway through my sophomore year of college, starting to try to learn French in Southern California, that I couldn't become completely fluent unless I immersed myself in that country. So I spent my senior year of college in France studying in French and, trying to get up to speed on that. And then I got into that industry and I realized that it just wasn't for me. There were things that I felt I had to do to be successful in that industry that were just not part of how I was raised, and just, it didn't feel good to me. And so I basically floundered, right? I got temp jobs. I did this, I did that. I worked at a clothing store for a year, and that's when I realized I loved sales. And then I talked my way into getting my first real sales job. I went in for 3 days of training and I came back and I literally spent about 2 days almost in bed crying and freaking out because I somehow had gotten myself hired and I didn't even know if I could do this job, right? So that was what have I done? Luckily, I was selling sound systems, message marketing, and, overhead music. So there was no patient lives at risk. And I just, sucked it up on that, second and a half day. And I went, well, you did this, let's figure it out. And it just was one day at a time, one day at a time. And I just refused to ever say that I was not going to be able to do this, because I always knew that if you were willing to put in the time and the energy and you had the desire to learn, you could do it. And then I got into surgical device. And surgical device, I had a lot more handholding. I had the most incredible manager and mentor and friend to this day that I could have. The team that I was on was extraordinary, various different levels of expertise in all different arenas, with the product that we had. The marketing team was awesome. The leadership team was great. It was a smaller company. It was before we got bought by, one of the global industry leaders. And so everyone was willing to lean in and get on a call with you and, have you fly out and, visit some of their surgeons, or, some even left their territories and flew in to help me. And so I think it was the confidence that everyone else had that I was going to make it that helped me continue, even as I was getting, mentally body slammed against the wall by the value analysis committees on a daily basis. So I think you have to have the personality that says, no matter what, I will put in the time and I'll put in the effort. And that gives you the confidence to know that you'll make it.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Marney. And I'm just curious because you, of course, had developed the competence. You really didn't struggle with the confidence component just because of one, your organic personality versus those that were having the confidence in you. And so would you say that having an equal balance of the two allowed more opportunities to present themselves?
I think there's actually data out there and studies that show people who are innately confident in themselves have a higher success rate in everything. I would say classic example, and once again, we're deviating outside of healthcare, so gone rogue on my own agenda. Generals at war or people leading, soldiers into battle. If you can't transfer your confidence in the face of incredible odds against you, you stand a chance. And yet we've seen miraculous things happen when people are put in a high pressure situation and they've got a leader that transfers their confidence. I think there's situations where your competence is extremely important, things like, anything with finance, operations. Obviously, trial lawyers have to have a high level of confidence and competence. Same thing with surgeons. So I really think that the question that's kind of underlying here is, how can someone who is not innately confident get confident enough to convince other people to give them a shot? That's not something that any of us can help with. That comes from within you. You've got to find that. And you can search it out through other ways. I would say the first thing is to look at something you're already really, really good at in life and figure out how you got really, really good at that. And just know that as long as you take those same steps and you work that hard, you're going to get there for anything if you're given a shot.
What about when someone is overconfident? When does that become dangerous in leadership?
I think that's dangerous if you don't have the humility to accept when you're wrong and to listen to what others who are equally as intelligent, equally as thoughtful, equally care, or are working hard enough, have to say something, and you're just not willing to listen to that or to deviate from it. Overconfidence is only dangerous if it's to the detriment of the people around you and the task at hand. I assume you've had some experience with that. So what is your experience with overconfident people?
Yeah, I think it shows up in every arena, right? I mean, I've spent my whole career in healthcare, but it's shown up in different ways and in different roles. It goes back to personality, although I think that, we hear of the whole imposter syndrome, right? Like that's just something that's always out there, the whole theme. But when people are showing up overconfident, and especially when they have a team that is reporting to them, it to me it ends up being counterproductive because they're showing up in a format and in a way that is, in a sense, I don't think diminishing is the right word, but you might inadvertently be causing other team members to not show up confident when you're too overconfident, if that makes sense. And I can kind of see that in scenarios, when we're talking through these topics.
That sounds more like arrogance than confidence.
True, but I think sometimes there's a fine line between the two. Sometimes you have individuals that show up as both, and I've seen them displayed and overlapping. And so you're right. I think, they really are two different things. But when I think of people who have shown up overconfident, there's a layer of arrogance.
That sounds like a lack of humility.
Yeah.
I'm going to be really spicy here at the risk of pissing off a lot of people and saying, I don't know that there's such a thing as overconfidence as long as it's equally balanced with humility.
That's actually a good way to position that, right? Yeah, that's a good point, Marnie. As long as it's balanced with humility, because kind of to your point, if somebody's shown up overconfidence, what's probably drawing the conclusion or assumption that someone might come across as arrogant is their lack of humility. So I actually think you nailed it right on the head. Marnie, what is one thing you wish someone had told you earlier in your career about the balance between confidence and competent and the way that they can show up at different stages?
Ooh, so I've had this question before on a podcast, and it was more about talking about emotional intelligence and how I developed that very, very lately. It was not something that I was naturally gifted at. And that's the one thing that I lament. I don't know if someone had taught me that earlier, if I would have been willing to accept it. I think I had to have failed in accomplishing a goal. And the goal at the time was to get out of my sales role and to create this role that I just knew was going to be great for the organization. And I just knew that I was the ideal person, to do it, or at least the one person that was willing to take that huge income hit to, transition out of sales and into an internal role to build it. I fell to that over and over again. And it's because I needed to massively build up my EQ. So I don't know that I wish someone had taught me something sooner. I wish I had maybe failed a little bit faster so that it wouldn't have taken me into my late 20s to have to work on that. I could have maybe worked on it in my early 20s.
That's actually a good feedback. I mean, as we're wrapping up here, is that what you would say to the listeners, I guess, as well? Would that be a kind of a universal statement?
No, I think a universal statement to people in the confidence versus competence thing is at the root of all competence is work and repetition, to that point you made earlier. And so if you are lacking in confidence, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Just start putting in the work and getting those repetitions in until you get confident enough. And simultaneously, it never hurts to have mentors, sponsors, advisors within and outside your organization who are confident in you, even if you lack it, to help promote you and lift you up and to help build that if that's what you need.
I love that. And with that, we'll wrap up, but I really want to hear what our listeners have to say on this topic. I mean, there's just,
yes.
I think for so many reasons. I mean, one, this is an area that it shows up everywhere. So it's not independent of, a specific specialty that you're in or area of your career. I think this applies across the board. So I would love to hear what our listeners have to say. And as always, Marnie, this has been super exciting. I love the topics that we're unpacking together and look forward to the next episode.
You can find more interviews on our YouTube channel at Marney Reid Presents.